started? Yeah. Go ahead.
The study Bible says he's worth 10,000.
Yeah. So that's one way of looking at it. It's a footnote, though, in the new NIV that says most Hebrew manuscripts mention, it says, for now there are 10,000 like us. And it may not have been that there was actually 10,000, or it could have been. But there's a lot of guys, okay? A lot of people. And David's got a formidable force now. And actually, you know, when you've got God on your side, like David did, even though David's paying for the consequences of his sin, David still has God on his side. And he could have had 3,000 men, and God still would have given the victory. We don't know how many men Joab, or Absalom rather, had pulled together. There are times when they've pulled together people in Israel. In fact, David counts the fighting men later for all of Israel and Judah, and he comes up with a number like 1.3 million fighting men. And that's only a few years after this incident here. So there could have been 100,000 that had come out with Amasa and with Absalom to kill David, to take him out. And so David's now sending out his force, and he says, okay, I'll agree with you. I'll do whatever seems best to you. So the king stands beside the gate while all his men march out in units of hundreds and of thousands. And the king calls the three commanders together, and he says to Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, and he says this, be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake. And all the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. Now stop and think for just a moment. Why? Absalom had already done, at this point, at least 4 things that caused him to be deserving of death. And there was no way that the two, Absalom and David, could ever reside alive in the same kingdom. Not with what Absalom had done. Absalom had slept with 10 of his father's wives. He had declared war, and the only resolution between the two of them at this point was either exile for one of them or death. And it was more likely to be death, knowing what we know about the people of Israel. And so he had already done all this stuff, and yet David is saying, be gentle with him. Now why? Why would David do that? Well, for number one, it's his son. And if you've ever had a child or have a child, you realize that even when they're wrong, you still love them. And even when they're wrong, they're still your child. David's error here, though, was that David was the king. He was the God-appointed king. And what might have been good for David as a person was not a wise choice for David as king. Because, as I mentioned, it had to end in either one of them dying or being exiled. It couldn't end any other way. For the stability of the kingdom, it couldn't end any other way. And David was still God's appointed. Absalom was not God's appointed king. David was. And even though David's paying for his consequences of his sin, he's still the God-anointed king, and God wasn't done with him yet. And yet David is saying, be easy on the young man. It wasn't it was a good choice as a dad. It was a bad choice as a king. And so one of the things here that we see is that, and Joab's an interesting character. Joab was definitely driven by, he was motivated by power. He was motivated by revenge. He enjoyed being in charge. And you'll see even indications here and there where David wanted to kind of bring him under control, and he wasn't able to. At one point he said, I'm the king. but I can't control these sons of Zeruiah. And it was a real frustration to David. And yet at the same time, Joab did things that were for David's good. But I think sometimes you have people in your life who get something on you and they use it to manipulate you. And this may have been happening here because I don't think everybody knew that David had killed Uriah. Joab knew. And it was one of those things like, he's like, you know, we know. Here's what I want you to do. And he felt like he couldn't control him. Joab had that kind of a personality that was very hard to control. And so Joab heard what was being said to him and to Abishai and to Ittai, and he goes out and the battle is engaged. And it was quite a battle, and it began to spread. It says the battle took place actually in the forest of Ephraim in verse 6 of chapter 18. And notice it doesn't take long until we see that Israel's troops are routed by David's men. Now this is not unusual because the entire time that we have been watching David, looking at David, thinking about him, every time David goes into battle, David's a winner. David's a winner. He had failings in his own personal life, his own moral life, may not have been the greatest dad, but he was consistently blessed by God in his battles. And so they should have known this. They should have understood this, but they didn't. And so all these people from Israel now have come to fight. And here's David's small force of men compared to them. And they begin to fight. And all of a sudden, Israel's on the run. And they're not only running and dying, but they're running into the forest. And it says in verse 7 that the casualties that day were great. 20,000 men. So again, I don't know how many men David had, but there's a bunch of the guys on the other side that are dying here. And it says the battle spread out over the whole countryside. And look at this. The forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword. Now that could mean one of two things, one of maybe three things. It could mean that the forest was so dense that as they're fleeing through the forest, it slowed them down enough that David's men caught up with them. It could also mean that there were sufficient numbers of wild animals in that forest that when they went through there, I mean, it was nothing in those days for there to be lions and other animals that were there. And as they're trying to get away and they're fleeing, they were caught by these wild animals. And it says that the forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword. So that might have been in addition to the 20,000. We don't really know for sure. But now we've got Absalom. And Absalom's riding along on a donkey. That was the kind of the way the kings and the royal people rode. And he's riding through the woods. And these have got to be, if you've ever seen one of those movies where they've got these really dense woods and the branches almost come out and grab a hold of you. If you can imagine a thick forest like that, and Absalom, proud, arrogant Absalom with his long head of hair, he's riding through this forest. And he comes to this branch, and again, the commentators were a little bit, some of them said one thing, some said another. I've seen, the traditional picture I've seen in my mind is his hair gets hung, and his donkey keeps going, and his hair's there, and he's just kind of dangling in the air. Well, one of the commentators said it was very likely that his neck had gotten caught, and that he wasn't hanging by his hair. I kind of like the picture of seeing him hang by his hair, actually. But whatever the case was, his feet are not touching the ground. And he's just kind of hanging there. Now, if he'd been hanging there any length of time by his neck, he might have been getting weak. If he was by his hair, can you imagine? You're hanging and you're trying to get yourself loose. And maybe you're so proud and so vain that you don't want to cut your hair, you might be able to get your dagger out, but that's my hair. I got to look good. I'm going to win this battle. I got to look good. I don't know if that was the case or he's just stuck some way. Maybe he was stuck by his neck. Maybe stuck by his neck and his hair. But he's hanging there. And around the corner on this path comes one of David's men. And they see Absalom. And Absalom sees them. And the guy looks at him. I can just imagine that moment. Absalom's hanging there and he can't get loose. And one of his enemies comes around the corner, and he can't get at his weapons. He can't reach anything. And the guy sees him, and then he disappears. And he runs back to Joab. He says, Joab, back there, about 100 paces back and around the corner, it's Absalom. He's hanging in the air. Joab said, and you didn't kill him? He said, if you'd have killed him, I'd have given you a warrior's belt. I'd have given you silver. And his soldier said, I know you too well. He said, you'd have let me take that one by myself. And you wouldn't have even admitted you knew me. That's basically what he's saying. He said, besides, didn't you hear what David told us, what King David said to us in the hearing of everybody? He said, be easy on the young man. And so Joab's like, well, in fact, he says, even if you'd offered me 1,000 shekels, that's 25 pounds of silver. He said, I wouldn't have hurt him. And so Joab says, I'm not going to wait like this for you. And Joab's like, okay, if you want something done, do it yourself. And so he takes 3 javelins in his hand, and he comes around, and again, if Absalom was conscious, think about the looks that went between the two of them. Joab is the one that got Absalom back when he was with the king, his grandfather, the king of Geshur. And it was Absalom or not Absalom, but Joab, who went to the king after he'd been back for 3 years and said, hey, let him back into your presence. And so maybe Joab felt like he was kind of responsible. Or maybe he just realized, hey, you know what? It didn't work. Too bad for you. And he hefts that javelin, and he connects eyes with Absalom, and he rams the javelin into him, and another one, and another one. And then Joab's men are not very far behind him, 10 of his armor bearers, and they all gathered around him, and they just had a hack fest. They were just whacking away at him, and they took his body down, and they began to pile stones on top of it. And I read something interesting about that. What happened to somebody in those days that, people would say, okay, that's where Absalom is. Oh yeah, let me take part in this. And they throw a rock onto the spot where Absalom's body lay. And as a result of that, there was not only rocks there, but because people kept coming by and like, that kid Absalom didn't even respect his dad. And they would throw their rocks, and so it would cause a heap of stones to be gathered. And that's what happened here. And so, interestingly enough, they've heaped up this large heap of rocks. But all the Israelites then, the trumpet's been sounded, the troops stopped pursuing Israel, because Joab knew that if Absalom's dead, the rest of them aren't going to push the issue. They had all loved David until Absalom turned their hearts. Absalom's out of the way now. And so, and look at this. During his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the king's valley as a monument to himself. For he thought, I have no son to carry on the memory of my name. And he named the pillar after himself, Absalom's Monument. I saw something here, and then Saul had actually kind of done the same kind of thing previously. And I realized that there's a truth here. Those who erect a monument to themselves are the ones usually that no one else would erect a monument for. So Absalom knew nobody else is going to put this monument up. I'm going to do it myself. And at one point, I think I'm right in remembering that Saul put a monument up for himself. And somebody in modern days who did that for himself that I don't think anybody else would have done? Yeah, Saddam Hussein, yeah. He had put up this big monument to himself. If somebody's going to put up a monument to themselves, they're probably the kind of person that nobody else is going to put a monument up. Now, Abe Lincoln would never have put up a monument for himself. And yet, other people did. And here, just kind of an interesting note for Absalom. Very proud young man, and one of the things that caused his pride is partly what caused his death. So now we've got this son, Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. He's like, let me run and take the news to the king that the Lord vindicated him by delivering him from the hand of his enemies. There's not a clear indication that Ahimaaz knew that Absalom was dead. Not clear. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. And so he says to Joab, let me run. Joab says, you're not the one to take the news today. You can take the news another time, but not today. Because the king's son is dead. So there he did know. So Joab says to a Cushite, go tell the king what you've seen. Now, I haven't read from anybody else that says this, but I can't help but wonder why he chose a Cushite. Cushites were black. And I think that maybe there was something about who the messenger was that could give an indication when they were a distance away, and they could get a little idea and maybe prepare them. Maybe I'm totally off base, but I can't help but wonder. Ahimaaz was a Jew. And so he says, no, you're not the one to take it today. You see, you're a good man. And later on, when they say to David, look at this, David is sitting back home, and Ahimaaz has bugged him. The Cushites already run. And so Ahimaaz says, oh, come on. He says, let me run behind the Cushite. And Joab's like, why do you want to go? You don't have any news that are going to bring you a reward. And he said, come what may, I want to run. So Joab said, all right, run. So Ahimaaz runs by way of the plain. And whether that's in the Hebrew, that could be a style of running, or it could be a different route. I lean toward the route because that's what our translators have leaned toward. But he chose a better route. And so the watchman's up on the top of the wall, and he's looking, and the watchman calls out to the king and says, hey, I see a man running alone. The king says, well, if he's alone, he must have good news. Then the watchman sees another runner. Look, there's another man running alone. Now, if it had been bad news, there'd have been a bunch of them. Okay? So they're thinking, okay, it's good news. It's good news. So the runner comes closer, and the watchman sees another runner. And so, look, another one running alone. Well, he's bringing good news. Well, it looks to me like the first one, he runs like Ahimaaz, son of Zadok. Oh, and look at this. He's a good man, the king said. He comes with good news. Now, it maybe has nothing to do with the race of the person bringing the message. Maybe it was just what the king knew about them. And maybe it was the fact that if the king knew some good things about this person, Ahimaaz, that he would expect good news to be coming. But if the Cushite's coming and he doesn't necessarily know him by name, it's more acceptable to have bad news. So he comes running up and he calls out to the king, all is well. And he bows down before the king. Praise be to the Lord your God. He's delivered up those who lifted your hands against my Lord. The king said, is the young man Absalom safe? Now, when you look back to what Joab said to him, you may take the news another time, but you must not do so today. Verse 20, because the king's son is dead. Okay, Joab told him that. Now, it's possible that Ahimaaz wasn't paying attention. He was a young fella, and sometimes young fellas don't pay attention, okay? So maybe he honestly didn't know, but Joab had told him, okay? And so he comes up to the king, and, he says, I saw great confusion. just as he was about to send your servant and me, your servant, but I don't know what it was. Stand aside and wait here, because he kind of wants to coordinate. He wants to check out the stories from both of these guys, make sure they're accurate. And so the Cushite arrives, and he says, my lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has vindicated you today by delivering you from the hand of all those who rose up against you. Now the king wanted to know one thing. Is the young man Absalom safe? The Cushite replied, and he says this very wisely, very tactfully, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man. So he didn't really come out and say, oh, he bit the dust. Joab ran him through with 3 javelins. He just says, may all of your enemies be like him. And the king is just, he's torn apart. And he goes up to the room over top of the gateway and he begins to wail. Jewish people are very emotional, very expressive. If you've ever watched a video of a Hebrew wedding, they dance and they sing and they're very celebrative. They're also very expressive in their grief. And so David is up there wailing and calling out his son's name, Absalom, my son, Absalom. And he's going at this over and hour after hour. And so the guys come back. We jump into the beginning of chapter 19, and the guys are coming back into the city. And normally what happened when a victorious army came back into the city, there was singing and there was celebration and there was, people shouting and welcoming them back. But when they came back, there was none of that, because over top of the gateway, up in this room, where everybody could hear, the king is wailing. And so instead of coming back in as victors and as the winners, they came in like puppy dogs with their tails stuck between their legs. And they're kind of creeping back in, ashamed that they've caused their king grief. And so Joab is told what's going on. And he says, king is weeping and mourning, and the whole victory was turned into mourning. And so the men stole into the city, verse 3, as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. And so he's still wailing and wailing and wailing, and Joab goes up to him. Now I've told you this before, but here's another place. Joab, even though he is self-serving, Joab is, at this point, 100% loyal to David. Some see what Joab does here as Joab kind of exercising his power. Because see, Joab is the one now, he's killed Abner when the king didn't tell him to. And now he's killed the king's son. Now maybe he doesn't know that Joab, I'm sure he probably does know by this time that Joab is actually the one that did this. But Joab comes into the room and he's like, you know what, king? If you don't snap out of this, you're proving to all of us that you care more about those who are trying to kill you than you do about the men that went out there and risked their lives for you. Now, did David need to hear that? Yes. Without a question. Because David, even though, see, this is where David was not doing a good job of separating the father from the king. And where you can understand, yes, as a father, his heart is absolutely crushed. He's dying inside. And he's saying, I wish it had been me instead of you, Absalom. As a father. But as a king, he's got these 8,000 or 10,000 men who went out and risked their lives for him. And he has caused all of them to feel ashamed at what they've done to save his life. And so Joab speaks truth here when Joab says, you have humiliated all your men who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You've made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you'd be pleased if Absalom were alive today and if all of us were dead. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come on you from your youth till now. Now, some people see that as Joab threatening the king. Possibly. I wasn't there. To me, this is a loyal man who did what needed to be done and did what he knew had to be done. And now he's coming back to David and he's telling David what David needs to be told, and knowing that, see, David was on the verge of losing everything here. Because if somebody else becomes king, David's going to die. And Joab is acting to preserve David. And so the king gets up, he listens, he takes his seat in the gateway, and the men are told the king is sitting in the gateway, and they all come before him. And so we're going to stop there for tonight, and we'll pick up at verse 9.